wine and a piece of bread. I will then give you in charge of a trusty slave, who will lead you through the garden and through a small door at the back, and will guide you to any spot where you may wish to go. Even now, doubtless, a watch is being kept up in the front of the house. When the officials arrive I shall tell them the truth, that coming, as I drove, upon a lad who was being attacked and murdered by a number of brutal peasants, I carried him off in my chariot. As to the shouts I heard, that you were the slayer of the cat of Bubastes, I regarded it as an invention designed to hinder me from interfering on your behalf; that I questioned you upon your arrival here, and finding that, as I had supposed, you were entirely innocent of the offense charged against you, I urged you to leave at once, letting you depart by the garden gate in order to escape the fury of your persecutors. As you are not an Israelite, no one can suppose that I could have any motive for shielding an offender from the punishment of his crimes. Do not thank me, for time presses, and you must be moving, so as to be well away before it is known that you have left. May the God we both worship, though as yet in ignorance, guide and preserve you and carry you and your friends through the dangers that beset you." Moses drew back the curtains from before the entrance to the chamber and clapped his hands, and ordered the servant who answered the call to tell Mefres to come to him. An old slave speedily appeared, and Moses ordered him to take Amuba out by the private way and to guide him by quiet roads back to the city. Then cutting short his guest's expressions of thanks for the great kindness he had rendered him, he hurried him away, for he knew that at any moment the officials might arrive from the city. It was well that Amuba had been supplied with a guide, for upon issuing into the night air, for by this time darkness had fallen, he found that he could with difficulty direct his steps. His head throbbed as if it would split from the blows that had been dealt him, and every limb ached. The old slave, however, seeing that he stumbled as he walked, placed his staff in one of Amuba's hands, and taking him firmly by the arm led him steadily on. It seemed to the lad that he went on walking all night, and yet it was less than an hour after starting when his conductor found that he could go no further, and that he was wholly unable to answer his questions as to whither he wished to be guided. He determined to stop with him until he should be able to proceed again. He therefore led Amuba aside into an orchard, and there laid him down under the shelter of a tree, covering him with one of his own garments. "It is well for the lad that my lord arrived just when he did," he said to himself, as he sat down by the side of Amuba and listened to his heavy breathing; for all in the house had heard from the charioteer of the rescue of the lad from the hands of furious peasants. "He must have been very near death when he was saved from their hands. Maxis said that his assailants shouted out that he was the slayer of the cat of Bubastes about which such a turmoil has been made. Had it been so, I do not think that my lord would have aided him thus to escape, though for my part I care not if he had killed all the cats in Egypt, seeing that in my native Libya we worship not the gods of the Egyptians." Several times during the night the old man got up and plucked large handfuls of grass wet with dew and placed them on Amuba's head, and when he perceived the first faint gleam of morning in the sky he aroused him. Amuba sat up and looked round with an air of astonishment. "Where am I?" he exclaimed. "You are at present in an orchard, my young friend, though to whom it may belong I know not; but finding that you were unable to continue your journey, I drew you aside here, and you have slept well all night, and I hope feel better for it and able to proceed." "I remember now," Amuba said. "It seemed to me that I walked for hours leaning on your arm." "It was but an hour," the slave replied. "We are not yet 2 miles from my lord's house." "And you have watched over me all night," Amuba said, "for it was, I know, but an hour after sunset when we started. Truly I am deeply indebted to you for your kindness." "Speak not of it," the old man replied. "My lord gave you into my charge, and I cannot return until I can tell him that you are in safety. But if you are able to walk we must pass on, for there may be a search for you as soon as it is light." "I am perfectly able to go on," Amuba said. "Thanks to the wet grass I see you have been piling round my head, the heat seems to have passed away and the throbbing to have ceased." Amuba was indeed now able to walk at a brisk pace. "Which way do you want to go?" the slave asked him in a short time. "It is getting light enough now for me to see your face, and it will never do for you to meet anyone. Your head is still swollen, and there are marks of bruises and cuts all over the scalp. Your appearance will attract attention at once, and if any saw you who had heard of last evening's doings, you would be at once suspected." "I will make direct for the hills," Amuba said. "They are not far distant, and I can easily conceal myself among the rocks until sunset." "Let us hurry on, then," the slave said. "It is but half an hour's walk, but as we may at any moment now meet peasants going to their work, I will go on ahead. Do you follow 100 yards behind me. If I see anyone coming I will lift my hand above my head, and do you at once step aside from the road into the vineyard or orchard, and lie there until they have passed." Amuba followed these instructions, and it was more than an hour before he reached the foot of the hills, so often did he have to turn aside to avoid groups of peasants. At last he reached the foot of the rugged ascent. Here he took leave of his guide with many warm thanks for his kindness and services, and with a message of gratitude to his lord. Then Amuba ascended the hill for a short distance, and laid himself down among some great boulders. Although greatly refreshed by his night's rest he was still weak and shaken, and felt altogether unequal to making his way along the hills for the 4 miles which intervened between himself and the hiding place of his friends among the tombs above the city. He was soon asleep again, and the sun was already some distance down the sky when he awoke. He waited until it sank behind the brow of the hill above him, and then climbing some distance higher made his way along the hillside, having little fear that his figure would be noticed now that the hillside was in shadow. Darkness had just fallen when he arrived at the tomb they used as their shelter. A figure was standing there in deep shadow. As he turned the path and approached, it advanced to meet him. Then there was a cry of joy, and Jethro sprang forward and clasped him in his arms. "My dear Amuba, I never thought to see you in life again." A moment later Chebron ran out, and in his turn embraced Amuba. "I shall never forgive you, and I shall never forgive myself," he said reproachfully. "What right had you to take my danger upon yourself? It was wrong, Amuba, and I have suffered horribly. Even though we are as brothers, why should you sacrifice yourself for me, especially when it is my life and not yours that is forfeited? I told myself 1,000 times last night that I was base and cowardly in allowing you and Jethro to risk your lives for me, when by giving myself up the rage of the people will be satisfied, and you could make your way out of this land without great danger. It was bad enough that you should share my risk, but when it comes to your taking it all upon your shoulders that I should escape free, I can accept such sacrifice no longer, and tomorrow I will go down and surrender myself." Amuba was about to burst into remonstrance, when Jethro touched him as a sign to be silent. The Rebu knew how acutely Chebron had suffered, and how he had spent the night in tears and self-reproaches, and felt that it was better to allow his present agitation to pass before arguing with him. "Are you hungry, Amuba?" he asked. "That I am, Jethro. I had nothing save a mouthful of bread since our meal here yesterday, and you will get no news out of me until I have eaten and drunk." A meal of cakes and cool fish and a draught of wine was soon taken, and Amuba said, "Now I will tell you all about it." "We know the first part," Jethro said. "When I returned here yesterday evening I found Chebron almost beside himself with anxiety. He told me how he had been discovered by one of the slaves of Ptylus, who knew him by sight; how you had attacked the slave, rescued him from his hands, and then joined him in his flight; how you insisted that you should separate, and how the pursuers had all followed on your track, leaving him to return here unmolested. He had been here upward of 2 hours when I arrived, and as the time had passed on without your return, he had become more and more anxious. Of course I at once started out to gather news, and had the greatest difficulty in persuading him to remain here, for he scorned the idea of danger to himself from the search which would be sure to be again actively set on foot. However, as I pointed out it was necessary that if you returned you should find somebody here, he at last agreed to remain. When I got into the town I found the whole city in the streets. The news had come that the slayers of the cat had been discovered, that one had escaped, but that the other had been overtaken after a long chase, and that he had been set upon and would have been slain, as he well deserved, had not one of the princes of the royal house arrived and carried him off in his chariot. The news excited the greatest surprise and indignation, and 2 officers of the city had gone out to the prince's mansion, which was 6 miles away from the city, to claim the fugitive and bring him to the town, when he would be at once delivered to the just anger of the populace. As soon as I learned this I started out along the road by which they would return, and hurried on past the people already gathered there. I had brought my sword with me, and my intention was that as the chariot returned with you I